They told you the tribes vanished, that after Moses led them out of Egypt, they scattered into myth, nameless, faceless, gone. That's the lie that started the whole cover-up. Because if you ever learned where they really went, you'd realize who you are. Picture it, Egypt, golden sand glowing red under the dying sun. The Hebrews, walking barefoot through dust that still remembered Pharaoh's whip. But here's the part they don't teach. These weren't pale wanderers out of a children's Bible illustration. These were dark-skinned people, copper, mahogany, obsidian, faces baked by the same sun that ruled over Kemet, broad noses, coiled hair, full lips, the very features Western painters scrubbed out of every holy image for centuries. The Exodus wasn't just a journey from slavery to freedom. It was the moment Africa birthed a diaspora that would echo across continents. The tribes didn't disappear. They migrated, they adapted, they survived. And the proof of that survival, the songs, the rituals, the very bloodlines, still hum in the veins of people who don't even realize they're carrying ancient passports. You ever notice how history books love to talk about the lost tribes of Israel, but never where they were lost from? They make it sound like they evaporated, poof, gone. But if they were lost, somebody had to hide them. Let's keep it real. Every empire that came after Egypt had a stake in rewriting that story. Assyria wanted to erase the Israelites' identity. Rome wanted to co-opt it. Europe wanted to bleach it. Because if the world ever admitted that the earliest Israelites were African descended, dark people, then every painting, every movie, every chosen narrative crumbles like sand underwater. Now here's where it gets deep. Ancient records, not rumors, records, describe the tribes spreading south and west after the fall of Israel. Some crossed into Ethiopia, some merged with Nubian kingdoms, others drifted along the Nile until they reached the Great Lakes region. Traders followed the routes into the Sahel, Mali, Ghana, Songhai, carrying the same laws, the same customs, the same names, the same God. Archaeologists call them mysterious Semitic African tribes. Historians call it coincidence. But coincidence doesn't carve identical patterns of Hebrew script on African temple stones. Coincidence doesn't preserve Passover-like festivals among tribes in Nigeria and Cameroon. Coincidence doesn't explain why oral traditions from the Ashanti to the Lemba trace their ancestors back to a people who fled Egypt and kept their covenant alive through the ages. And yet, none of that makes the textbook. You know why? Because the moment you connect those dots, Egypt, Israel, Africa, America, the whole world map flips upside down. Suddenly, the narrative isn't Europe brought the Bible to Africa, it's Africa wrote the first chapters. Suddenly, black people across the diaspora aren't outsiders to scripture, they're its descendants. But here's the crazy part. Every time a scholar or elder tried to speak that truth, they were silenced. The 1800s saw it buried under colonial science. The 1900s hid it under Christian missions. The 2000s ignore it under political correctness. Because this truth doesn't just rewrite history, it rewires identity. Imagine realizing that the story of Exodus isn't about them, it's about you. The people who crossed oceans in chains didn't just share the pain of Israel, they may have shared its blood. The same 12 tribes that once walked under the desert stars might have crossed the Atlantic centuries later, their legacy disguised as tribal or primitive, when it was in fact biblical and royal. Now if you're wondering, how can we prove that? That's exactly what they don't want you to ask. Because the receipts exist, in maps, in DNA, in ancient writings tucked away in European archives, where African names were quietly crossed out and replaced with Latin ones. They'll tell you the tribes of Gad, Reuben, Naphtali vanished into oblivion. But oblivion looks a whole lot like Africa, and Africa looks a whole lot like the missing pages of the Bible. See, this story doesn't start with being lost. It starts with being hidden, intentionally. And the question isn't where did they go? The The question is, why did they make sure you'd never find them? The first clue doesn't come from Europe. It doesn't come from a church or a textbook. It comes from the dirt. Ethiopia, Sudan, Mali, all whispering the same thing. The tribes didn't disappear. They went home. See, when the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel around 722 BCE, the tribes of Gad, Reuben, Naphtali, Asher, the so-called Lost Ten, didn't just vanish. They scattered south. Scripture even hints at it. 2 Kings says they were carried away beyond the river. Beyond which river? The Nile, not the Jordan. The Nile, the black world's main artery. You start to realize this wasn't an exile. It was a migration back into Africa, back into familiar soil. Remember, Egypt wasn't foreign to Israel. Abraham came out of Africa. Moses was raised in Pharaoh's court. The Israelites were an Afro-Asiatic people, rooted in the same sunbelt stretching from Sudan to Canaan. So when they fled north empires, they weren't lost. They were going home. Here's the part that gives historians headaches. Archaeological digs in Kush, Nubia, and Axum reveal Semitic artifacts dating after the Assyrian captivity, pottery with Hebrew inscriptions, even menorah carvings found deep in Ethiopian highlands. How does Hebrew pottery end up 2,000 miles south of Jerusalem, unless somebody brought it there? And guess what language still laces the oldest Ethiopian texts? Jez, an Afro-Semitic tongue that shares grammar with ancient Hebrew. The priests of Axum spoke it long before Europe found the Bible. They had the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, even a version of the Torah, all centuries older than anything in the Vatican vaults. You ever wonder why Ethiopia is the only African nation the Bible keeps naming, over and over? Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto God. That wasn't prophecy, that was lineage. Ethiopia held something sacred, a remnant, a link to those tribes that the world thought vanished. The Lemba of southern Africa, DNA tested and confirmed to carry the Cohen priestly gene, say their ancestors fled from Judea, settled in Yemen, then crossed the water into Mozambique and Zimbabwe. Their oral history is tight, not myth. They still keep kosher. They still circumcise on the 8th day. They still guard a sacred object they call the Noma Lungun, the drum that thunders, a replica, they say, of the Ark of the Covenant. And when the British heard that, they laughed, until they tested the wood. Ancient, Middle Eastern. Now picture this, West Africa, centuries later. Tribes like the Yoruba, Igbo, and Akan, carrying fragments of stories about Abraham, Jacob, and the desert journey. Igbo elders in Nigeria call themselves B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel. Their ancient symbols, Star of David. Their rituals, Mosaic. Their oldest songs, Hebrew-rooted. These weren't coincidences. These were fingerprints. And when the transatlantic slave trade began, who did European traders target? Those same regions, West Africa, the same hubs where remnants of the tribes had settled, thrived and multiplied. The same lineages that once escaped Pharaoh, now loaded onto ships under new masters. It's dark irony, the Exodus reversed. The same people who once walked out of bondage in Egypt found themselves chained again, this time bound for America, carrying the same songs of deliverance, the same hidden covenant. That's why spirituals like Go Down Moses hit so deep, because that wasn't borrowed scripture, that was memory, blood memory. So if the tribes didn't vanish, if they migrated, merged, and survived across Africa, the next question becomes, who decided to erase that trail? Because someone went out of their way to make sure you'd never connect the dots between Jerusalem and Timbuktu, between Gad and Ghana, between Naphtali and Nigeria. And when you find out who, you'll realize the lost tribes were never lost, just stolen. When the maps got redrawn, so did the memory. That's the move they pulled. Europe didn't just steal land, they rewrote geography itself. They cut Africa out of the biblical frame and drew fake borders over the truth. You look at any world map before the 1500s, And Africa is massive, detailed, alive. Ethiopia stretches across half the continent. Kush sits proudly under Egypt, and ancient Ghana and Mali glow with gold roots and libraries. But once colonizers stepped in, shrink, erase, rename. Suddenly, Ethiopia only means one small country, not the empire the Bible praised. Kush becomes a myth. Sheba turns into a bedtime story. Now, let's talk receipts. There are records, not rumors, that the Israelites kept moving deep into Africa. Timbuktu's manuscripts mention Hebrew-speaking merchants and priests living among Songhai and Mande peoples. North African rabbis wrote letters in the Middle Ages describing Jewish communities across the Niger Bend. Even Arab historians, Ibn Khaldun, al-Masudi, wrote about black tribes in Africa practicing Israelite customs. These weren't isolated stories. They were echoes of the same lost names: Gad, Dan, Reuben, Naphtali. So why didn't you learn that in school? Because Europe couldn't sell salvation if Africa already owned the blueprint. When Rome adopted Christianity, it became politics. It wasn't about truth anymore. It was about power. The early church needed a clean origin story, one that made Europe the new chosen land. That's why they airbrushed the African chapters out of the Bible's margins. They stripped skin tones from icons, lightened prophets in paintings, and renamed dark regions as lands of Ham to justify slavery. Ham, cursed; Shem, chosen. That's how they turned Africa from sacred to savage, with one bad translation and centuries of propaganda. But the older texts, the ones Europe tried to burn, tell a different story. The Kebra Nagast, the Ethiopian royal chronicle, says the bloodline of Solomon and Sheba lived on through their son Menelik. That bloodline ruled in Africa, not Europe, for nearly 3,000 years. Even the Ark of the Covenant, it says, was taken to Ethiopia, not lost. You start realizing the center of faith didn't move north, it stayed south, and it's not just myth. Look at the cultural code. In Ghana, among the Ewe and Ga people, traditional names like Ami, Abba, Kojo reflect a 7-day birth system, just like the Hebrew week. In the Yoruba Ifa system, the concept of divine law, ritual purity, and covenant mirrors Mosaic patterns, line for line. The Ashanti keep oral laws that sound suspiciously like Deuteronomy. Coincidence? Please, that's cultural survival. And here's where it gets wild. Linguistics. The word Yah, short for Yahweh, appears across Africa in tribal names and god titles. In Nigeria, Oluwa, meaning Lord, shares root with Oluwa. In Congo, Nzambi traces back to ancient Semitic roots for the creator. You don't get that kind of overlap unless there's shared ancestry somewhere deep in time. But here's the quiet crime. When the Europeans arrived, they saw those customs and instantly rebranded them as pagan. Why? Because admitting they were ancient Hebrew traditions meant admitting the people they were enslaving were the same lineage they read about every Sunday. Can't have that. Can't enslave Israel while preaching about it. So the evidence had to disappear. One bonfire, one missionary rewrite, one map redraw at a time. They told the Africans they were heathens. Meanwhile, those same Africans were practicing versions of the oldest covenant known to man. They made the teachers forget they were the original authors, and yet, even buried, the signs never stopped speaking. From Ethiopia's priests carrying the tabut, a symbol of the ark, to the Lemba protecting the Noma, to the Igbo singing psalms by moonlight, the memory stayed alive in code. They called it lost history. But what if it wasn't lost? What if it was hidden in the open, waiting for the day someone would finally read Africa like a Bible again? Because if that's true, the question isn't where did the tribes go anymore. It's who has been walking around this whole time, not knowing who they are. Before Greece, before Rome, Before anyone thought to wear togas or build marble statues, Africa had kingdoms running on law, trade, astronomy, and philosophy. The blueprint didn't start in Europe, it started under the African sun. You can trace the thread. Every civilization that ever claimed enlightenment borrowed their spark from the same source: Kemet, Kush, Axum, Nubia. These weren't just kingdoms, they were knowledge centers, libraries before libraries, courts before parliaments. And when the Israelites fled persecution, where did they go? Egypt, Africa. Over and over, the Bible points south for refuge. That's not a coincidence, it's a pattern. Every prophet, every patriarch who ran from empire, ran to Africa. Joseph rose to power in Egypt. Moses was raised by an African queen. Jesus, yes, Jesus, found safety in Africa when Herod tried to kill him. Ask yourself, why does divine protection keep showing up below the Nile? Because Africa wasn't the wilderness, it was the womb. The mother of civilization, the original sanctuary. That's what they don't teach. They want you to believe Africa was waiting for the world to arrive. Nah, the world was catching up. And when the Israelites scattered after the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles, they didn't vanish. They flowed down the same trade routes that had already been pulsing through the continent for millennia. Down the Nile into Sudan, across the Great Rift into Kenya, westward into Chad, Nigeria, and Mali. Those weren't migrations of desperation, they were returns home. Now look closely at how African governance worked before Europe ever showed up preaching democracy. The Ashanti had councils, where decisions required the agreement of the Queen Mother and the chiefs. The Igbo had a system of community consensus, called Oha na Eze, the people and the king. Mali had assemblies under Mansa Musa that managed trade, law, and scholarship. You think Greece invented politics? Africa was running nation-states when Athens was still arguing over whose turn it was to light the torch. And here's the thread that ties it back to the tribes: governance built on covenant. The idea that the leader was chosen by divine law, held accountable by elders, bound by oath to serve the people. That's straight from the Torah. You can see it in how African kings swore oaths on sacred objects, how law was recited aloud before the people, how breaking a covenant wasn't just a crime, it was spiritual suicide. Now, remember the tribe of Gad. Their symbol was the tent, the camp, the protector. In West Africa, the Hausa and the Fulani trace ancestral stories of warrior tribes who came from the east, crossing rivers with sacred scrolls and herding traditions that mirrored ancient Israelite customs. The tribe of Reuben, known for pastoralism, left marks in East Africa, where cattle culture ruled for centuries. Naphtali, linked to speed and strategy, left oral stories in Central African warrior societies, whose songs praise the children of Jacob who crossed the river. These aren't Bible fanfics. These are tribal lineages preserved through rhythm and ritual. You ever wonder why African drumming patterns sound like coded language? Because they were. Communication systems, genealogies, law, history, passed through sound because the colonizers couldn't burn a song. They burned scrolls, they burned libraries, but they couldn't silence rhythm. The people who remembered the covenant started hiding it inside the culture. Now let's talk bloodlines. When geneticists began sampling ancient DNA from North African and sub-Saharan populations, something kept showing up. Markers consistent with Levantine ancestry, not the European kind, the ancient Near Eastern kind. Scientists wrote it off as trade contact. But how does trade explain identical Y chromosome lineages among Lemba priests and modern Israelites? How does trade explain oral traditions describing the Ark, or customs that trace direct descent from sons of Jacob? It's because the migrations were real. These weren't stories meant to make anyone feel special. They were records of survival. The Israelites didn't disappear, they adapted. They found new homelands, new tongues, new names, but the covenant stayed the same. And you can see it in the way African societies guarded divine law like it was oxygen. And when you think about it, if Africa was the motherland, and the Israelites found refuge there time after time, Who's to say they ever really left? Maybe return to Zion was never about geography. Maybe it was about memory. Maybe the real Zion wasn't a patch of land in the Middle East, but the spiritual heart of Africa that carried the covenant all along. Europe sold the world an edited map. They put Israel up there, Egypt over here, and drew the equator like a dividing line between holy and heathen. But when you line up the old maps, the ones drawn before colonization, you see it clear as day. Ethiopia wasn't just a nation, it was an idea. It meant all black lands, a kingdom stretching from the Nile to the Niger, bound by faith and ancestry. And that's the wildest part. Africa never stopped being sacred. The world just forgot how to read it. Because if the covenant crossed the Red Sea, if it flowed through the Sahara and settled in the lands of gold, then maybe the real question isn't did the lost tribes go to Africa? Maybe it's how much of Africa is the lost tribes. So ask yourself, when the drum beats, when the choir sings, when the ancestors whisper in the wind, are they reminding us of who we were or who we still are? When the colonizers arrived, they didn't just take land. They took memory. They rewrote maps, renamed kingdoms, and labeled every trace of Hebrew heritage in Africa as myth or primitive religion. Because if the world ever realized Africa held the remnants of the original covenant, every narrative about civilization, salvation, and superiority would collapse overnight. The cover-up started in the pulpits and classrooms. European missionaries arrived with Bibles in one hand and erasers in the other. They taught Africans about Israel, while standing in the lands where Israel's descendants had fled. They pointed to the Middle East and said, "That's Holy Land." Meanwhile, they were preaching in Ethiopia, Sudan, Nigeria, the very soil carrying the same covenant bloodline. Think about that irony. They brought the word to the people who wrote it. Take the Lemba in southern Africa, a tribe with ancient oral histories about crossing the Red Sea, carrying a sacred object called Noma Lungdu, the drum that thunders. When European explorers heard it, they laughed. Decades later, genetic testing confirmed what the Lemba had always said. Their priests share the same Cohen DNA markers as Jewish priests in Israel. Coincidence? Not even close. Or the Beta Israel in Ethiopia, for centuries called Falasha, outcasts, unbelievers. When researchers finally listened, they found entire Torah scrolls written in Jays, preserved for thousands of years. Ritual circumcision, Sabbath observance, dietary laws, all identical to ancient Israelite customs. But for decades, Western scholars dismissed them as imitations, because if they weren't imitations, then the entire Eurocentric timeline of religion collapses. And collapse it does, because if Africa had the covenant first, then Europe was the student, not the teacher. Colonial Christianity couldn't handle that truth, so they painted Africa as heathen. To justify domination, they replaced covenant with conversion. They told Africans they were lost souls, not the keepers of the original law. Missionaries destroyed shrines, burned records, and translated holy names to strip them of power. Yah became Jehovah. Yeshua became Jesus. Yisrael became Israel, geographically locked to a small desert strip instead of a global covenant. Every linguistic edit pushed the story further from its African roots. Then came academia. 19th century historians like Hegel outright said Africa had no history. That was the script. Erase, replace, and reframe. The same people who found pyramids in Egypt called it not truly African. The same people who studied Hebrew law dismissed African legal systems as tribal custom. Because if you ever admit Africa had sacred law, advanced science, and divine lineage, then the whole civilized versus savage myth falls apart. And that myth was the foundation of empire. It's not just religion, it's economics. If you convince the world that Africa contributed nothing, then stealing from it feels justified. Slavery, colonization, resource theft, all built on the idea that Africa was a blank slate. But it wasn't blank, it was blacked out. Even today, school systems still push the idea that civilization started in Mesopotamia. But dig deeper. Mesopotamia means land between rivers. Which rivers? The Tigris and Euphrates, both originating from regions influenced by ancient African trade and migration. The earliest Sumerian gods share names and symbols with Cometian deities. The flood myths of Gilgamesh mirror the Nile's cycles. Africa wasn't outside of the story, it was the story. Let's get even clearer. Look at language. Hebrew and ancient African tongues share root words. The Hebrew word for life, chai, echoes in Swahili's hai. The word for peace, shalom, resonates with salam. Linguists try to explain it away as coincidence, but the overlap is too deep, too old. These aren't coincidences, they're linguistic fingerprints of a shared ancestral tongue. Then look at the migration patterns after the fall of Jerusalem. Ancient texts mention refugees fleeing south through Egypt and Ethiopia. Many continued westward across the Sahel. Centuries later, we find the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Ashanti, all holding rituals with uncanny biblical parallels. Sacred arcs, 7-day purification cycles, priestly garments, dietary codes. The deeper you go, the clearer it gets. The line never broke, it just changed form. But the colonizers had a problem. If Africans are the children of Israel, then slavery wasn't just cruelty, it was blasphemy. Enslaving the covenant people would make Europe Egypt 2.0, so they had to rewrite the narrative. The slave ships became civilizing missions. The Bible became a tool of obedience. The Africans, who once guarded the law, were taught to bow to their own book. That's the deepest level of control, spiritual inversion. They didn't just chain the body, they chained the mind. But truth leaks. Every generation, someone remembers. Scholars dig up artifacts that don't fit the Western timeline. Hebrew inscriptions in West Africa, Jewish graves in Zimbabwe, Star of David patterns woven into 15th century Ghanaian cloth. The establishment calls it coincidental geometry. But how many coincidences does it take before coincidence becomes pattern? You can hide truth from books, but not from rhythm. African music still carries coded liturgy. The blues, gospel, reggae, all trace back to spirituals sung by descendants who knew they were in exile. Go Down, Moses wasn't just a song, it was encrypted scripture. Wade in the Water wasn't metaphor, it was instruction. That's the legacy of a people who remember, even when the world forgets. And now, the internet age has made suppression impossible. You can't burn scrolls in a digital world. Every DNA study, every artifact, every oral tradition is a crack in the dam. The truth is flooding back. And once people start connecting the dots, Africa, Israel, the covenant, the cover-up, history as we know it begins to unravel. Because if Africa is the origin, not the afterthought, then everything flips. The oppressed become the chosen, the forgotten become the foundation, and suddenly, the story we were told for centuries starts to sound like fiction, written by the victors. So when they say forget the past, remember this: the past isn't gone, it's buried, coded, and waiting. And every rhythm, every name, every heartbeat in the motherland is whispering the same message: we were never lost, the world just forgot where to look. Long before the Vatican crowned kings, or Europe learned to read scripture, African temples were decoding the stars. The scribes of Kemet charted the heavens with precision so sharp, NASA still marvels. Timbuktu scholars mapped the cosmos and wrote of worlds beyond ours. They didn't need a telescope. They had lineage, knowledge passed hand to hand, inked on papyrus and stone, while Europe was still in the mud. And this isn't myth, it's documented. The Greeks called it studying in Egypt for a reason. Pythagoras, Plato, Solon, all the fathers of philosophy were students of Nile Valley priests. That means your Western education was homeschooled in Africa. The same geometry that built the Parthenon was a watered-down version of what Africans had mastered 2,000 years earlier. They say democracy began in Greece. Cute story. But look at the Oyo Empire of West Africa. Before Athens ever held a vote, the Yoruba had the Oyo Messi, a council of elders who could overrule the king. Checks and balances, debate, consensus, accountability, the core of democracy. Except the textbooks don't call it that. They call it tribal council. The Ashanti had the Assentaman Council, structured parliaments, voting systems, and succession laws. Ethiopia's Gadaa system, generations electing leaders every 8 years through age-based ranks, peaceful transfers of power, the very thing Europe claimed to invent. Africa had refined centuries before. Yet somehow, Europe gets enlightenment, and Africa gets custom. Ask yourself, why? Because admitting Africa led the world doesn't fit the script. The same Western historians who credit Rome with civilization refuse to acknowledge that Rome's own laws mirror the codes of Egypt, Kush, and Carthage. They cherry-pick receipts. But here's the punchline. Even their holy books tell on them. Moses, raised in Egypt, educated in the house of Pharaoh. So where did Hebrew law come from? It wasn't born in the desert. It was forged in African courts. The 10 Commandments sound a lot like the 42 laws of Ma'at. Older, deeper, African. Thou shalt not steal, Ma'at had it. Thou shalt not kill, Ma'at had it. Do not covet your neighbor's goods. Straight from the Nile, the DNA of the divine law runs black and ancient. So how did the teacher become the student, then the villain? Because history got monetized. Empires don't conquer to learn. They conquer to own. When Rome burned Carthage, it wasn't war. It was intellectual theft. Libraries torched, scrolls stolen, scholars enslaved. They erased the receipts and claimed the credit. Then came the Moors, the black scholars who rebuilt Europe from its own ashes. From the 8th to the 15th century, they ruled Spain, built libraries in Cordoba, introduced algebra, optics, and surgical tools. Europe was still bleeding patience to balance humors, while African doctors performed cataract surgery. That's not exaggeration. That's in the medical archives of Al-Andalus. And what did Europe call it when the Moors saved them? The Dark Ages. Dark for who? Because while Europe slept, Africa was wide awake. Mali's libraries overflowed. Ghana traded in gold and manuscripts. Songhai ran universities before Oxford even existed. The Moors didn't just bring light, they were the light. And Europe spent the next 500 years trying to snuff it out. When Portugal and Spain finally pushed the Moors out, they didn't stop at victory. They rewrote the story. The architects of Europe became the villains. The black scholars became faceless invaders. They took the brilliance of African Islam, renamed it Arabic learning, then filtered it back through white translators who got famous for rediscovering what Africa taught them. And that's the game. Erase the origin, repackage the product, sell it back to the descendants. When Europeans colonized Africa, they weren't just looking for gold or slaves. They were hunting knowledge. Maps, medicinal plants, architecture, mathematics. They stole scrolls from Timbuktu, relics from Ethiopia, and artifacts from Nubia. What they couldn't understand, they labeled superstition. What they could, they rebranded. Alchemy became chemistry. Mysticism became philosophy. African spirituality became mythology. But you can't plagiarize forever. Every stolen idea leaves fingerprints. Look at the Greek goddess Isis, the blueprint of the Virgin Mary. Horus, the prototype of Jesus. The imagery, the miracles, the symbolism, all African, just painted pale. The same way they whitewashed the walls of Egypt, they whitewashed the divine. And yet, the spirit of those teachings never died. The diaspora carried them, hidden in folk tales, coded in songs, remembered in rhythm. Every drumbeat in Haiti, every chant in the Carolinas, Every sermon in a black church is a remix of the ancient blueprint. The cadence, the fire, the resistance. That's Africa talking through generations, even after centuries of silence. Because they could steal the words, but they couldn't erase the feeling. The heartbeat of Mad, of Oyo, of Ethiopia, it still lives in the soul of the diaspora. That's why, when black people talk about justice, it hits different. It's ancestral. It's encoded. We're not asking for equality. We're demanding restoration. And once you understand that Africa wasn't the footnote, but the foundation, history flips. You realize the Western timeline is backwards. Civilization didn't spread to Africa. It spread from Africa. And every empire that rose after simply built with stolen bricks. So if Africa taught the world everything from law to light, why was she silenced? Why erase the teacher and glorify the student? Maybe the better question is, what would happen if the teacher started to remember again? They'll show you Tutankhamun's gold mask 1,000,000 times, but never the truth behind the skin underneath. Because once you admit the pharaohs were black, the whole deck of Western history collapses. Egypt wasn't a foreign miracle. It was an African masterpiece. Kush, Nubia, Kemet, same bloodline, same brilliance. These weren't desert tribes. These were dynasties of engineers, astronomers, and priests, shaping time itself. Look closer at the tomb paintings they airbrush on museum walls. Broad noses, full lips, brown skin polished by the Nile sun. You can't miss it unless you want to. Every dynasty south of the Delta was African, pure, and proud. The 25th dynasty, the Kushite kings, ruled Egypt and restored its glory when the so-called great empires of the north fell apart. These men, Pi, Shabaka, Taharka, are names they whisper, not shout, because Taharka alone changed world history. This was the pharaoh the Bible itself mentions, the Black King, who faced the Assyrians, and whose shadow falls right across the story of Israel. He was power personified. Yet when you flip open your Bible illustrations, suddenly everyone's pale. Ask yourself, why would European artists repaint African royalty into white saviors? Because if the prophets were black, the lineage was African. And that makes the entire Western religious hierarchy a stolen inheritance. Moses raised in Egypt, under African gods, African language, African law. Joseph ruled in Egypt, second only to the pharaoh, married to an Egyptian priest's daughter. So tell me, how do you build your faith on African soil, learn from African sages, then erase every trace of them later? When Israel fled Egypt, they didn't march into Europe. They went south, west, into the lands that would become Ethiopia, Sudan, Chad, Nigeria. The trail is there, in DNA, in names, in customs. The tribes of Gad and Reuben are found echoed in West African tribes today, the Gadara, the Ewe, the Igbo. Even their rituals, Sabbath rest, circumcision, purity laws, identical reflections of the Torah. Coincidence? No, continuation. See, the same wandering tribes didn't vanish. They migrated. Some stayed near the Nile, others crossed the Sahel, down into the rainforest kingdoms, and across the Atlantic. The diaspora didn't start with slavery, it started with exodus. The Middle Passage was just the second scattering, and what the colonizers called tribes were often remnants of ancient houses, descendants of Benjamin, Naphtali, Levi. That's not fantasy, that's genealogy, buried under centuries of silence. Even Ethiopia, long isolated, fiercely independent, guards relics the West calls legend, the Ark of the Covenant. They say it rests in Axum, under watch by a single priest for life. That's not new. That's tradition older than Rome. Ethiopia's kings claimed descent from Solomon and Sheba, and every coronation carried the echoes of that divine promise. That means African thrones weren't just political. They were biblical, and it wasn't just in the Horn. Across the continent, prophecy echoed through kingdoms like Benin and Mali. Priests taught cosmic balance, Rulers followed spiritual codes of truth and order, reborn in new tongues. Even in the Americas, when Africans arrived in chains, they carried these echoes. Voodoo, Santeria, Candomblé, they aren't pagan, they're memory. The prophet's fire translated into survival. You can trace it all the way to today. Every gospel song, every revival shout, every amen rolling through a church in Georgia or Lagos, that's the same rhythm that once filled temples along the Nile. When we talk about the Spirit, we're talking about inheritance. The power that carried Moses through the Red Sea is the same one that carried enslaved Africans through the Atlantic, the same one that carried civil rights marchers through tear gas. It never died. And yet the world calls it coincidence. They call it religious influence. No, it's ancestral recall, the same divine pattern running through millennia. That's why when black people read the Old Testament, it feels familiar, because it is. Western historians won't admit it, because it destroys their monopoly on divinity. You can't rule the world spiritually if people realize they're descendants of the very prophets you turned into fiction. That's why they scrub museum plaques clean of color, why they keep artifacts locked in the British Museum, why they rename Ethiopian Christianity as exotic orthodoxy. They can't let the story return to its source, because the source is black. But here's the twist, you can't hide truth forever. DNA is shouting what history tried to whisper. Artifacts in Sudan and Nigeria carry Hebrew inscriptions. Old trade routes align perfectly with the exile paths described in the Bible. Oral traditions in West Africa still speak of a people who came from the East long before colonization. The lost tribes were never lost, they were renamed. And once you start connecting the dots, it's impossible to unsee. So the real question isn't where the tribes went. The question is, what happens when the descendants start remembering who they are? And you'll see the fingerprints everywhere. The same geometry that aligned pyramids to Orion appears in temples across Sudan, Ethiopia, and even Zimbabwe's great enclosure. The same burial rites, the same solar symbols, the same reverence for balance and order that Maat demanded in Egypt still echo through African art and architecture thousands of miles away. That's not diffusion, that's inheritance. But here's what they never say out loud. When archaeologists dig too deep and find Africa's fingerprints under every ancient civilization, they change the labels. Egyptian influence, Phoenician traders, external contact, anything but African origin. Because if the story starts in Africa, then everything after becomes a remix. Greece, Rome, even modern science. Let's be real. Egypt wasn't a random oasis that accidentally birthed civilization. It was a node in a web, connected to Kush in the south, Punt to the east, and the Niger Valley to the west. Trade, marriage, migration, constant flow. The Black Nile Valley wasn't isolated genius, it was continental genius. Even the Bible hints at it. Moses' wife, a Cushite, from Nubia, Zipporah, meaning the covenant family, was tied to Africa by blood from the start. The prophets spoke of Egypt and Ethiopia as kin, not foreigners. The Queen of Sheba didn't come as a tourist, she came as equal royalty, African royalty, to negotiate wisdom with Solomon. And when her son, Menelik, returned home carrying the ark, the covenant wasn't leaving Israel, it was returning to its roots. So when people say the lost tribes vanished, they're repeating a colonial myth, the same myth that shrank Africa on maps and painted Pharaoh's face pale. The tribes didn't vanish, they blended back into the continent that birthed them. The temples of Nubia, the synagogues of Axum, the sacred hills of the Yoruba, all chapters of one unfinished book. The irony? The world is just starting to rediscover what Africa never forgot. DNA studies linking African communities to ancient Levantine genes, archaeological finds tying West African iconography to Hebrew motifs, oral histories aligning with migration routes that predate empire. The receipts are showing up, one dig, one archive, one drumbeat at a time. And every discovery cracks the Western myth a little more, because once you accept that the Nile, not the Tiber, was the world's first university, that Moses learned in African courts, that the Ten Commandments echo Maudit's laws, that the word Amen itself is Kemetic, you realize the cradle of civilization never left Africa's arms. They can repaint the statues, rewrite the scrolls, and redraw the borders, but the melanin tells the truth, the soil tells the truth, the songs tell the truth. So when you look at Tutankhamun's face, don't see a mystery, see memory, because every monument, every rhythm, every name carved in stone is whispering the same message through the centuries. Africa wasn't just part of history. Africa is history, and the people the world calls lost were never lost at all. They've been home the whole time, waiting for the world to remember. The tribes spread across Africa in ways that were deliberate and strategic, not accidental. They carried sacred knowledge, law, and ritual into lands that had long been connected through trade, rivers, and kinship. In the Sahel, oral traditions speak of people who arrived from the east, bringing scrolls, tablets, and songs that instructed the living on how to keep covenant. These weren't isolated arrivals. They were waves, moving along paths already established by centuries of African commerce and migration. The traders and priests of Israelite descent settled in Mali, Ghana, and Songhai, embedding themselves in communities while preserving distinctive practices, Sabbath observance, ritual purification, priestly roles, and coded prayers that mirrored Torah law. The rhythms of these communities carried history. Every drum, every chant, every festival was a living archive. Across the Niger Bend, names, genealogies, and ritual patterns closely resemble the tribes of the Exodus. Among the Yoruba, elders tell of ancestral figures arriving from lands to the east, bringing divine instruction and governance rooted in covenant. Igbo elders in Nigeria identify themselves as Beni Yisrael, the children of Israel, and their rituals maintain the cadence of the Hebrew week. 7-day cycles, ceremonial purification, priestly attire, and even dietary laws align remarkably with ancient Mosaic law. These weren't isolated curiosities or mimicry, they were survival mechanisms. The covenant traveled with the people, disguised as tradition, ritual, and folklore. When the Atlantic slave trade began, these connections did not vanish. Africans carried memory, encoded law, music, and ritual across oceans. Enslaved Africans did not lose their covenant. It transformed. Spirituals became coded transmission, instructions, warnings, encouragement. Songs like Wade in the Water offered literal guidance, while others preserved history and theology. Ritual knowledge survived in masked dances, voodoo ceremonies, and Santeria rites, disguised as cultural adaptation. The diaspora became a network of memory, safeguarding covenant under the most brutal suppression. Religion was a language of resilience. African-derived spiritual systems in the Americas were not inventions. They were continuations of Israelite law and ritual, transformed for survival. Bloodlines preserved the covenant as well. Genetic studies reveal that certain West and Central African populations carry Levantine Y chromosome lineages. The Lemba of Zimbabwe and South Africa, for instance, maintain priestly markers identical to the Cohen lineage of Israel. Igbo, Yoruba, and other West African communities trace oral genealogies to Israelite ancestors. DNA, combined with oral history, confirms that migrations were not just cultural but biological. These tribes were not lost, they were dispersed, hidden in plain sight, and yet remarkably intact. Africa's sacred geography became a living archive. Ethiopia guarded Torah texts in Jays, preserved priestly tablets, and maintained continuous ritual law. Timbuktu's manuscripts recount Hebrew-speaking merchants and priests within Songhai and Mande communities. Arab historians like Ibn Khaldun documented Jewish and Israelite practices among black African tribes. Evidence existed in texts, in names, in rituals, and in the land itself. The continent was a repository of covenant memory long before European interference. When missionaries and colonialists arrived, they misread what they found as paganism or superstition, rather than recognizing the living preservation of Israelite tradition. The suppression was deliberate. European colonizers could not allow Africans to be recognized as bearers of covenant law. It would have undermined the ideological foundations of slavery, conquest, and empire. Labeling Africans as heathen justified violence and exploitation. Erasing covenant history and misrepresenting cultural practices created a false narrative that African people were disconnected from sacred law, and that Europe held the moral and spiritual authority. Every fire, every translation, every rewriting of maps and histories reinforced this control. Yet the covenant persisted, encoded in memory, art, music, and lineage. The chains could restrain bodies, but not knowledge that had been embedded in generations. This continuity can be seen in ritual law, mirrored across African kingdoms. Governance structures, legal codes, and community councils often reflect covenantal principles. The Ashanti Council required consensus among chiefs and the Queen Mother. The Igbo's Ohana Eze allowed communal decision-making, echoing principles of accountability and justice found in Mosaic law. In Mali, assemblies under Mansa Musa managed trade, religion, and civic law, preserving the same sense of order and divine oversight that characterized Israelite governance. These were living systems of law and morality, operating independently of European influence. Civilization was not introduced, it was inherited, preserved, and adapted. Trade routes served as arteries for the covenant. Migration patterns from the Nile to the Niger facilitated the spread of ritual knowledge, law, and sacred artifacts. Artifacts bearing Hebrew inscriptions are found deep in West Africa, mirroring the travels of Israelite-descended communities. The Lemba preserved a sacred drum and an ark-like object. Timbuktu preserved manuscripts describing rituals, festivals, and governance structures identical to Israelite practice. Even music maintained coded law and lineage information, disguised as rhythm and melody. Drums, chants, and songs were resistant to destruction, a form of indestructible communication. Colonization and slavery attempted to sever memory, but the covenant endured. African spiritual systems, oral histories, and material culture all preserved the thread. The Atlantic diaspora carried covenant memory intact, transforming it into a spiritual, cultural, and social code that guided survival. Spirituals, coded messages, ritual practice, governance, and community structures were adaptations of the covenant, proof that the tribes were never lost, only displaced. The conclusion is unavoidable: the lost tribes were hidden, not destroyed. They traversed Africa, safeguarding covenant knowledge, law, and ritual. They survived dispersal and conquest, maintained lineage through blood and tradition, and carried memory across oceans. The narrative of disappearance was manufactured to protect exploitation, erase African authorship of civilization, and maintain control. Today, genetic evidence, ritual practice, and oral history converge to reveal the truth. Africa is both the sanctuary and the origin of the covenant. The tribes never left, they were preserved, scattered, but intact, waiting for recognition. And as the descendants remember, the story is no longer about loss, it's about continuity, reclamation, and identity. Across the Atlantic, the covenant did not vanish. It transformed into survival encoded in culture, ritual, and communal law. Enslaved Africans were stripped of homeland, names, and property, yet the memory of Israelite law persisted in subtle, resilient forms. Spirituals, work songs, and hymns functioned as oral Torah, guiding behavior and preserving moral frameworks. Steal Away and similar songs were both lamentation and instruction, teaching when to move, how to endure, and whom to trust. Rituals, disguised as Christian worship, retained 7-day cycles, purification practices, and dietary observances, small but potent acts of covenant preservation. Enslaved communities were repositories of living law, passing knowledge covertly across generations, despite systematic efforts to eradicate it. Communities in the Caribbean and the American South codified Israelite principles into governance. Quarters of plantation villages often mirrored tribal hierarchies, assigning elders and spiritual leaders authority to arbitrate disputes. Ritualized community meetings resembled synagogue councils, maintaining consensus-based decision-making. These were not inventions, they were adaptations of covenant law, suited to the constraints of enslavement. Even the architecture of villages, spacing of homes, and arrangement of communal spaces often reflected symbolic order, a form of ritual geography, echoing Israelite tradition. Knowledge of law and lineage was encoded spatially, socially, and ritually, ensuring continuity under duress. Resistance and rebellion were also shaped by covenant memory. Revolts were never random, they were moral acts justified by sacred law. Leaders such as Nat Turner and others claimed divine mandate, aligning actions with a broader moral order inherited from ancestral covenant knowledge. Revolts, escapes, and survival strategies were not only political, they were theological. The covenant provided a moral framework that validated autonomy, justice, and communal protection. Knowledge of sacred law became both shield and weapon, guiding ethical resistance in the face of overwhelming oppression. The preservation of covenant knowledge was multifaceted. Naming practices carried memory. Children were given Hebrew or symbolic names, encoded with ancestral lineage. Foodways retained ritual law, with fasting, preparation, and consumption echoing Mosaic dietary restrictions. Festivals and celebrations aligned with ancient cycles, even when Christian forms were imposed. Drums, chants, and rhythms encoded genealogies and moral instruction, functioning as mnemonic devices to safeguard law and lineage. Oral culture allowed transmission of detailed knowledge without written records, a deliberate strategy in contexts where literacy was suppressed. Every song, story, and ritual served dual purposes: spiritual enrichment and covenant preservation. The transatlantic slave trade became a paradoxical conduit. Though designed to sever identity, it inadvertently dispersed covenant knowledge, creating networks that connected the Americas to Africa through ritual, song, and lineage. Vodou in Haiti, Santeria in Cuba, Candomblé in Brazil, all carry remnants of Israelite ritual disguised under African cosmology. Sacred objects, priestly hierarchy, and ritual law survive within these systems, often mischaracterized as superstition by outsiders. Embedded law persists even under new religious forms, demonstrating the adaptability of covenant knowledge. Survival required secrecy, preservation demanded transformation. Education, too, became covert. Elders and spiritual leaders instructed children through stories, parables, and allegories. These teachings emphasized justice, ethical conduct, communal responsibility, and obedience to divine law. Moral instruction was inseparable from covenant knowledge. The enslaved were not illiterate in law or ritual, they were forced into an alternate literacy, one that relied on memory, performance, and coded communication. This education ensured intergenerational transmission of identity, law, and moral authority, sustaining covenant integrity even under brutal oppression. Migration patterns within the Americas reflect strategic covenant preservation. Enslaved Africans moved along rivers, forests, and hidden paths, establishing autonomous communities whenever possible. Maroon settlements in Jamaica, Suriname, and the southern United States maintained ritual, law, and governance reflective of ancestral systems. Geography became sanctuary and classroom. Communities were structured to maintain lineage, ritual practice, and communal decision-making. Knowledge of sacred law determined alliances, dispute resolution, and survival strategies. Covenant principles dictated both ethical and practical action, ensuring coherence across dispersed populations. Even under the imposition of European law, covenant memory influenced social norms. Communities maintained principles of justice, accountability, and moral hierarchy derived from Israelite precedent. Elders' authority, dispute mediation, and ritual accountability preserved moral order. Marriage, inheritance, and communal responsibility were guided by ancestral law. Social cohesion, survival, and resilience were functions of covenant memory, demonstrating that even in the most oppressive environments, law and morality, rooted in ancestral tradition, could persist. Cultural expression became a living archive. Music, dance, storytelling, and ritual encoded ancestral knowledge and law. Rhythm, melody, and gesture were carriers of memory, a living Torah transmitted without text. Drumming patterns in West African-derived traditions map genealogies and moral instruction. Dance preserved ritual sequence, purification practices, and sacred calendars. Storytelling encoded history and law, teaching youth about lineage, justice, and divine mandate. This was not artistic indulgence, it was functional, purposeful preservation of covenant identity. Every beat, every gesture, every word maintained continuity between past and present. By the 19th century, these networks of memory had coalesced into identifiable cultural patterns across the Americas. Despite forced assimilation, suppression of literacy, and the violence of slavery, covenant knowledge survived through encoded ritual, moral instruction, and communal law. The narrative of loss was a deliberate distortion. The reality was preservation and adaptation. The covenant endured in African diasporic communities, shaping identity, guiding resistance, and sustaining lineage. Africa was not lost, and its descendants carried the covenant as living memory across oceans and centuries. By the early 20th century, African-descended communities across the Americas began reclaiming covenant memory in more visible ways, combining ritual preservation with cultural expression and social activism. The Harlem Renaissance in the United States, for example, became a stage for rediscovering ancestral identity. Writers, poets, and musicians drew on memory of law, moral code, and lineage to construct art that was both aesthetic and ethical. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and others embedded biblical motifs, parable structures, and ethical imperatives reminiscent of covenant law into literature, music, and folklore. Jazz and blues preserved rhythmic patterns akin to ancestral rituals, while lyrics carried encoded historical memory. Artistic expression became a form of legal and moral testimony, asserting the endurance of a sacred heritage despite centuries of systemic erasure. Religious movements paralleled artistic revival. The early 20th century saw the rise of black churches as centers of both worship and community law. Congregational governance, moral accountability, and ritual observance mirrored ancestral covenant structures. Leaders invoked divine mandate to challenge social injustice, aligning civil rights activism with sacred precedent. The doctrine of justice, communal responsibility, and ethical governance in these churches was an extension of ancestral covenant memory, reframed to address modern oppression. Civil rights leaders, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Fannie Lou Hamer, drew upon biblical law and covenant principles to legitimize activism, linking spiritual heritage to political and social action. Simultaneously, diasporic communities in the Caribbean and South America engaged in revivalist movements that blended African and Israelite ritual memory. In Haiti, Vodou priests maintained ceremonial hierarchies, ritual calendars, and moral codes reflecting covenant law. In Brazil, Candomblé temples enacted purification rituals, initiation sequences, and social structures that replicated ancestral law. These movements were not simply religious, they were embodiments of legal, ethical, and cultural continuity. Sacred law, encoded in rhythm, movement, and ceremonial practice, continued to guide community governance and interpersonal conduct, reinforcing identity under post-slavery conditions. Education and scholarship began reclaiming these hidden forms of knowledge. Historians, anthropologists, and ethnographers documented ritual, oral law, and ancestral memory, connecting diasporic practices to historical covenants. Lob Dubois, Carter G. Woodson, and other scholars illuminated the moral, legal, and ritual frameworks embedded in African-descended communities, challenging narratives of cultural void imposed by colonial historiography. Academic work validated lived experience, demonstrating that enslaved and diasporic populations had not lost law or lineage, but had preserved it in forms resilient to oppression. Schools and informal institutions within these communities increasingly taught history, moral philosophy, and communal ethics rooted in ancestral memory, ensuring continuity into the modern era. Migration, urbanization, and global diaspora networks in the 20th century further facilitated covenant preservation. Caribbean migrants to the United States, African-descended populations in Europe, and South American communities maintained ritual, ethical, and cultural continuity across continents. Festivals, religious observances, and social organizations functioned as legal and moral anchors. Naming practices, community councils, and ritualized conflict resolution sustained governance principles derived from ancestral law. Covenant memory adapted to urban contexts without losing structural integrity, demonstrating the flexibility of preservation strategies. Diasporic identity was actively performed and continually reconstructed, combining historical knowledge with contemporary social frameworks. Resistance and activism evolved alongside cultural revival. Covenant principles of justice and communal responsibility underpinned labor movements, anti-colonial struggles, and civil rights campaigns. Leaders framed demands for equality, self-determination, and legal recognition as extensions of sacred moral law. Ritual and ethical knowledge provided frameworks for organizing, strategizing, and maintaining cohesion under political pressure. The covenant, once encoded in clandestine rituals and songs, became a moral compass guiding modern political action, linking historical memory to contemporary justice. Mass media and literature further reinforced covenant visibility. Radio programs, newspapers, and later television broadcasts highlighted cultural achievements, historical knowledge, and ethical frameworks derived from ancestral law. Literary works, both fiction and nonfiction, foregrounded ancestral memory and moral continuity. Folk narratives, once transmitted orally, were now published and disseminated widely, ensuring wider recognition of covenant-based principles. Cultural representation became a tool for legal, ethical, and historical education, allowing communities to assert identity publicly while preserving the moral and ritual knowledge of the past. By mid-century, the intersection of ritual, art, scholarship, and activism created a multifaceted system of preservation. Covenant memory was no longer confined to private or covert spaces. It was embedded in institutions, literature, music, and political action. Communities actively curated ancestral knowledge, ensuring transmission across generations while adapting to contemporary contexts. Festivals, educational programs, and religious observances reinforced the covenant, encoding principles of law, ethics, and governance into lived experience. Diasporic networks strengthened, allowing cross-continental reinforcement of moral and ritual continuity. Even contemporary movements, such as Black Lives Matter, Afro-descendant cultural initiatives, and Pan-Africanist scholarship, draw on these historical threads. Ethical and moral frameworks, rooted in covenant memory, inform activism, governance, and communal organization. Ritualized practices in religious, social, and cultural spaces continue to transmit ancestral law, teaching ethical conduct, justice, and communal responsibility. Memory of covenant law underpins both public and private spheres, illustrating the enduring power of encoded knowledge over centuries of displacement, oppression, and adaptation. Across centuries, covenant memory proved remarkably resilient, from covert rituals and oral law during slavery to public expression through art, scholarship, and activism. African-descended communities preserved identity, morality, and legal consciousness. The covenant survived not through written texts alone, but through adaptive, living practice embedded in song, dance, ritual, governance, and memory. It became both shield and compass, guiding resistance, maintaining cohesion, and asserting continuity in the face of centuries of systemic erasure. Covenant memory endured as living law, reshaped by circumstance, yet fundamentally intact, a testament to the resilience, ingenuity, and determination of diasporic communities. Entering the 21st century, the preservation and transmission of covenant memory shifted into digital and globalized arenas. Online platforms, social media, and digital archives allowed diasporic communities to connect across continents instantly, sharing ritual knowledge, historical narratives, and ethical frameworks. Podcasts, YouTube channels, and social networks became virtual temples and libraries, hosting discussions on ancestry, moral responsibility, and legal traditions embedded in covenant memory. Unlike earlier physical gatherings, these digital spaces enabled widespread participation, creating transnational audiences and reinforcing collective identity without geographic constraint. The internet also facilitated the democratization of historical scholarship. Crowdsourced research, open access archives, and digital storytelling projects allowed community members to engage directly with ancestral law and ritual knowledge. Previously marginalized voices could document their histories, interpret texts, and contextualize traditions in ways that challenged dominant narratives. Digital repositories preserved oral histories, ceremonial instructions, and communal ethics, making them accessible for education, activism, and cultural continuity. These platforms amplified covenant principles, turning private memory into shared interactive knowledge. Diaspora organizations leveraged technology to organize transnational activism rooted in ancestral law and moral principle. Movements addressing racial justice, reparations, and cultural preservation drew on covenant-based ethics to frame objectives and strategies. Ethical mandates embedded in ancestral memory informed governance structures, leadership selection, and community accountability. Virtual councils, webinars, and online symposiums became spaces for debate and decision-making, applying centuries-old principles of communal responsibility to contemporary global contexts. The covenant's ethical logic guided negotiations, collaborations, and conflict resolution across continents, reinforcing a sense of unified purpose despite geographic dispersal. Cultural production adapted to this digital era, embedding covenant memory in multimedia formats. Music videos, short films, animations, and interactive media encoded ritual knowledge and moral lessons, translating ancestral law into forms accessible to younger audiences. Storytelling, once primarily oral or literary, now incorporated visual, auditory, and interactive elements, creating layered experiences that preserved ethical, legal, and social teachings. Festivals and cultural events, streamed online, allowed wider participation, merging traditional ceremonial practice with digital engagement. These innovations maintain continuity while adapting ritual knowledge for 21st century modalities of consumption and learning. Education systems also began integrating digital access to covenant memory. Virtual classrooms, MOOCs, and online workshops provided structured learning on African-descended legal, ethical, and ritual traditions. Diasporic communities developed curricula connecting historical practice to modern governance, social ethics, and cultural identity. Young people could trace lineage, explore ancestral law, and apply covenant principles to contemporary civic life, fostering continuity of knowledge and reinforcing moral grounding. Online mentorship programs, interactive simulations, and collaborative projects offered practical application of ancient principles in modern contexts. Simultaneously, global migration patterns maintained and reshaped covenant transmission. Urban centers in Europe, North America, and the Caribbean functioned as nodes of cultural convergence, where ritual, ethical practice, and communal law were continuously negotiated and adapted. Intergenerational dialogue occurred not only within families, but across digital networks, blending historical memory with contemporary social realities. Naming practices, rites of passage, and communal governance were adapted to multicultural contexts while retaining foundational structures of covenant law. This fusion of locality and global connectivity created resilient, hybrid forms of cultural preservation. Activism in the 21st century reflects this dual commitment to preservation and adaptation. Movements like Pan-African initiatives, climate justice campaigns, and racial equity programs demonstrate covenant memory in practice. Ethical imperatives from ancestral law inform leadership ethics, strategic priorities, and modes of engagement. Ritualized forms of accountability, transparent decision-making, public testimony, and communal reflection mirror traditional covenant enforcement mechanisms, ensuring moral coherence. Activism is not only a political exercise, but a continuation of centuries-old ethical practice, linking historical memory to modern societal transformation. Media representation evolved alongside activism. Digital storytelling, film, and social campaigns highlighted narratives previously suppressed, illustrating the ethical and legal dimensions of historical and contemporary experiences. Documentary projects, virtual exhibits, and social media campaigns showcased communal governance, ritual continuity, and ancestral ethics, creating a visible record of covenant-based identity. These narratives challenged dominant historical accounts, asserting moral and legal frameworks derived from centuries of diasporic practice. By situating historical memory within contemporary media, communities ensured covenant principles remained influential, publicly acknowledged, and culturally integrated. The resilience of covenant memory in this era also stems from adaptive strategy. Knowledge is codified in multiple, redundant formats: text, audio, video, ritual enactment, digital simulation, ensuring survival against erasure. Community networks actively curate, archive, and transmit this knowledge, prioritizing both accuracy and accessibility. Moral and legal teachings are reframed for contemporary issues without losing their foundational logic. Dispersed yet connected, digital, urban, and diasporic practices converge to sustain identity, ethics, and governance. The covenant becomes a living system, flexible, networked, and deeply embedded in social consciousness. In sum, the 21st century landscape demonstrates the intersection of technology, globalization, and tradition. Covenant memory
thrives through digital dissemination, transnational networks, multimedia cultural production, and educational integration. Activism in media amplify its moral, ethical, and legal dimensions, ensuring relevance across generations and geographies. Communities preserve the essence of ancestral law while innovating methods of transmission, merging history with contemporary necessity. The covenant survives as a dynamic, living structure, a moral compass, ethical code, and legal framework sustained across centuries, continually adapting yet fundamentally unbroken.